Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Friday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Along with Jim Geraghty of National Review, I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have good, bad, and crazy martinis for conservatives today. As soon as we're done recording, Jim is headed off on spring break, so if he starts talking about the beach in the middle of a political response, you'll understand why. Jim, thanks for hanging in there for a few more minutes.
Huh? What? No, I am fully attentive, Greg, but I'm just letting listeners know after that. Also, if you happen to be driving on I-95 South this afternoon, say in the states of Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, get out of the left lane, please, particularly if you're driving a tractor trailer.
They do tend to pile up, particularly in Virginia. But anyway, let's get you on the road here and get our listeners the martinis they need to close out the week. Let's start with our good martini, Wall Street Journal. Jim, the Deputy Attorney General, says the actual Attorney General is really doing a good job here. Rod Rosenstein, who the Democrats and the media seem to think has credibility because he's been critical of Trump at times, means that the words that he carries now as it relates to Bill Barr carry some extra weight. The Wall Street Journal reports Rosenstein is saying, quote, he's being as forthcoming as he can about the Mueller report and what's in it. And so this notion that he's trying to mislead people, I think, is just completely bizarre, Mr. Rosenstein said. Mr. Barr is under intense pressure to quickly produce the edited report amid concerns from Democrats that the Attorney General, a longtime advocate of executive branch authority, is seeking to protect the president from politically damaging information the report may contain. Their worries were heightened after reports that some investigators on Mr. Mueller's team had told associates in recent days that they believe the report is more critical of Mr. Trump on the obstruction issue than Mr. Barr indicated in his summary. Mr. Rosenstein would not say why Mr. Mueller rendered no conclusion on that critical question. Quote, it would be one thing if you put out a letter and said, I'm not going to give you the report, Rosenstein said. What he said is, look, it's going to take a while to process the report. In the meantime, people really want to know what's in it. I'm going to give you the top-line conclusions. That's all he was trying to do. So, Jim, what's the reaction going to be here? That Rod Rosenstein is also a Trump stooge, or is this going to have some people at least back off a little on Bill Barr and his timetable?
I'm sure there will be some corners of Twitter that will conclude, well, clearly the Russians got to Rosenstein. But I think ever since the Barr letter came out, we knew that it had to be at least a reasonably accurate summary of Mueller's report and the conclusions therein. But, it was a 4-page letter. There was we're now hearing between 300 and 400 pages and closer to 400-page report. There was probably going to be some stuff in it that was not flattering to the president. And the question would be, did Barr, were some of these judgment calls, did he downplay something? Did he give the Democrats in Congress any stick to hit him with to say, hey, the report mentions X, Y, and Z, and you didn't put this in the summary letter, and things like that. Was there anything in there to give them at least a little bit of fodder for this is all a cover-up, Barr is a partisan stooge narrative? And hearing this from Rosenstein is reassuring. Rosenstein allegedly was willing to wear a wire, according to some of the stories going around. I know he's necessarily denied that. But, Rosenstein is not a partisan hack. He was seen as the reliable guy, the trustworthy guy, the guy Democrats had no reason to really have a beef with. And so if he's coming out and saying, no, this is an accurate summary, then that's a pretty darn good sign. Now, I'm sure there will be some Democrats out there who will, still be committed to this. Oh, this is all grand cover-up narrative and things like that. We will know more when the report comes out. Apparently, it's coming out next week. As you mentioned, Greg, I won't be here, so you guys will have to discuss this amongst yourselves. But my suspicion is we will see. Some people will take the time to read through the nearly 400 pages, and they'll come to similar conclusions. Some will say, "Oh, Mueller mentioned this about obstruction of justice, and that looks bad for the president." The Mueller report did not say he was totally exonerated. It was the president who started singing those praises. There may be some stuff in there that portrays the president in a not very flattering light, but it was not enough to lead to criminal charges, or at the very least, Mueller chose not to reach a conclusion on that. He put it in the hands of Barr and Rosenstein, and they themselves both agreed that whatever was going on, it was not a good option for prosecution. Also, just the other comment about the redactions, there's from the beginning, there's been this kind of, murmuring among some congressional Democrats, and particularly the fever swamps of the Twitter, that this redaction process was something sinister. They're going to black out all the really bad stuff for Trump or something like that. Again, from Rosenstein comments, no reason to think this is the case, that everything they're going through, they're removing is grand jury testimony or involves other prosecutions or involves national security interests or some other really good reason. So, generally reassuring. We'll get it next week. I don't expect that the Mueller report will end up being a bombshell that Barr had, not honestly characterized in any way.
Wow. I'm only here the first 2 days next week, so our replacements are going to have to dissect that unless it happens Monday or Tuesday. But I think there is going to be stuff for the Democrats to point to. The fact that there was quite a bit of disagreement or at least competing evidence on the obstruction issue means there's going to be something that the Democrats are going to be chirping about a lot in the coming weeks here. But the ultimate conclusion from both Barr and Rosenstein was that it did not amount to criminal charges, as you said. So, on to our bad martini now, Jim. And we never like it when Republicans are fighting, particularly ones that are used to being in the good martini. But nonetheless, here we are. The Hill. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is publicly signaling to President Trump not to pick former Virginia Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli to lead the Department of Homeland Security. I'll do this in my best McConnell voice. Quote, "I've not spoken to him about any of them. I've expressed my, shall I say, lack of enthusiasm for one of them, Ken Cuccinelli." McConnell told reporters during a pen and pad briefing in the Capitol on Thursday. Cuccinelli, the president of the Senate Conservatives Fund, has been floated as a successor to DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, whose exit Trump announced on Sunday. The conservative group has battled with McConnell and his allies in GOP Senate primaries, including backing Tea Party challenger Matt Bevin in McConnell's 2014 re-election race. In addition to Cuccinelli, former Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach and acting DHS Secretary Kevin McAleenan are also reportedly in the mix to succeed Nielsen on a permanent basis. So, Jim, you and I living in Virginia, we pretty much love Ken Cuccinelli. He was a great state attorney general. We really, really, really wish he had been elected instead of Terry McAuliffe as governor in 2013. He's a rock-ribbed conservative. He's not crazy. Chris Kobach, I'm not sure we can say the same thing about, and that would be a really ugly confirmation fight. It's clear why McConnell hates Cuccinelli. He's got good reasons because Cuccinelli has deemed many of McConnell's friends, including McConnell himself, as not conservative enough to be the Republicans serving in the U.S. Senate. So we know why there's tension there, but to let that become the reason why a really good choice potentially for this job gets kicked to the curb is not okay.
Yeah, so it's intriguing that the example of Matt Bevin gets cited. Matt Bevin is currently the governor of Kentucky. Matt Bevin ran against Mitch McConnell and said that he was an establishment, that he'd sold out, that he'd gone soft in Washington, yada, yada, yada. McConnell wins the primary pretty handily, if I remember correctly. And then Bevin chooses to run for governor, and he wins the nomination. And all of a sudden you have a Republican gubernatorial candidate who has utterly denounced his state's senior senator in a pretty incendiary, pretty tough manner. And the question was, how are these two going to be able to get along? Since traditionally you like to have your senior senator and your governor on good terms. And the great irony is they buried the hatchet and got along great. And I think one of my favorite, I've never been able to find the full video, Greg, but apparently at one of the equivalent of the White House Correspondents' Dinner for the Kentucky Press Corps for some sort of event. Then Governor Matt Bevin, who'd been governor for about a year and had such a good relationship with Mitch McConnell, he did this little parody video in which he was running around the entire day wearing this "I Love Mitch McConnell" t-shirt. And he does all these things and everyone laughs and all that stuff. And then finally his wife makes a cameo and says, "Honey, come on. You've been wearing it for like every day for 3 weeks. It's time to take it off." He says, "Fine." He takes it off. And of course he's wearing the exact same t-shirt underneath. So he's been wearing two "I Love Mitch McConnell." So the point being that Mitch McConnell can bury the hatchet and end up having good, productive working relationships with people he's been in bad relationships, been in tough fights with before. This would be a good time to see that manifest itself again, because as I keep arguing with people when they don't like Trump cabinet nominees, look, we're not looking, you can't wish for the perfect candidate. We're looking for the best candidate that Trump is willing to pick, who's willing to work in this administration. And obviously, because you see how often working in this administration does not work out well for people, President Trump will castigate them on Twitter, like with Sessions. He'll undercut them and counter their decisions and throw them under the bus, like we saw with DeVos. This happened. You got to take the best of what you can get. And I think it's safe to say right now, Ken Cuccinelli is probably among the best options they have at Department of Homeland Security. Besides the reasons you mentioned earlier about the reasons we like him. First of all, I've always said that if you're on death row or if you are facing very serious charges, Ken Cuccinelli is who you want. And I remember when that gubernatorial race, Cuccinelli was not as naturally charismatic as Bob McDonnell. I guess you could say he wasn't gifted that way. That there were times people kind of, came across, he could come across as a bit of a cold fish or something like that. But I think, or maybe the better way of just raising a little bit of Lieutenant Commander data to him. Cuccinelli knows his stuff backwards and forwards, smartest guy in the room, and a really good lawyer. I think my favorite in his debate of the state attorney general was when he was running for state attorney general. It was each one got to ask the question of his rival, and the Democratic question was some variation of, "Aren't you an extremist?" And Cuccinelli said, "Please name the state attorney general's offices and their particular duties." And the opponent stammered his way through. Clearly, he hadn't done the homework, and Ken Cuccinelli does. So that's why I think he'd probably be a good choice. He's professional. He knows what he's doing. And let's face it, in this administration, that's not always what you're going to get. Sometimes you're going to get somebody who's not particularly qualified for the job or not reassuring or something like that. So. Look, Cocaine Mitch, this might be the best option you got. So I hope he is able to rethink this. Otherwise, you could be having, potentially skilled managers in an administration that is not full of people who have experience managing things. It would bring a certain professionalism to it and a certain, again, you just want the best people you can in these offices, and it seems like the idea of letting a dispute from years ago tank this does not sound like a good decision making.
On to our final martini now, and back to the Attorney General, Bill Barr. This time we're talking about his testimony before the Senate Appropriations Committee on Wednesday. He was supposedly there to talk about Justice Department budgeting, but of course nobody was asking him about that. They were talking about when you're going to release the Mueller report, when are you going to release all of it to Congress, and then he was talking about his decision to launch an investigation into how the Trump-Russia investigation got started in the first place. And so he used the term spying. He says spying did occur, and that's a big deal when it happens on a presidential campaign. And, of course, the Democrats are flipping out. A couple different people here. First of all, on CNN, here is former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper.
Well, I thought it was both stunning and scary. I was amazed at that and rather disappointed that the Attorney General would say such a thing. That the term spying has all kinds of negative connotations, and I have to believe he chose that term deliberately.
Yes, I'm sure he did choose it deliberately. And then here's Clapper later just spewing nonsense.
I think it would have been far more appropriate for him to just defer to that investigation. Rather than postulating with apparently no evidence. He just has a feeling that there was spying against the campaign.
He's referring to the Justice Department Inspector General investigation, but since we know about the FISA warrants, it's not just random speculation. But here's our favorite one, and this is more recent. Former FBI Director James Comey, very upset about this.
With respect to Barr's comments, I really don't know what he's talking about. When he talks about spying on the campaign, it's concerning because the FBI and the Department of Justice conduct court-ordered electronic surveillance. I have never thought of that as spying.
Have you noticed the declarative sentences that end up as interrogative sentences? It's very interesting there with Jim Comey. So all the vapors, Jim, all the vapors about the spying. Here's my conversation yesterday with your colleague, Andy McCarthy.
As a prosecutor for 20 years, in my cases, the government informants were always called spies by the defense lawyers, and we always called them informants. And, they always called them snitches, and we always called them witnesses for the state, and nobody in the jury fainted when any of these terms were used.
So what do you make of all these folks from the relative agencies that launched this investigation being just shocked and outraged at that terminology?
I suppose spying is sort of in the eye of the beholder. I do remember this taking listeners way back. Early 2001, before the 9/11 attacks, early in the presidency of George W. Bush, when the U.S. had what we called a surveillance plane that flew along the border of the airspace of China. Uh-huh. It encountered trouble, landed at a Chinese base, and there was negotiations and kind of a bit of tension there about whether we were going to get our air crew back. And we kept, the news report said an American spy plane, and they said, no, this is a surveillance plane. I do believe Comey is starting to reach the point, Greg, where it's if you're not dangling from the ceiling like Tom Cruise in the Mission Impossible movies, it doesn't qualify as spying. Look, what would you call, listening into someone's phone calls and sending people to ask them questions under false pretenses? And if that's not spy, first of all, kind of the implication of this is you can only really spy on someone in the international context. If it's Americans, trying to learn more about other Americans, it's just surveillance. It's just fun. Look, whatever you want to call it, what Barr wants to get to is, was it proper? Was it justified? Was it based upon sufficient evidence to say, okay, there could be something involving the Russian government here that is malevolent, sinister, an effort to manipulate the American political process. And it's impossible. It is possible that it was. It's also possible that it's not, and that this was driven by partisan passions or a just knee-jerk reflexive suspicion of Donald Trump. One of the things that kind of became, people started murmuring after the Mueller report came out. Remember Carter Page, who was kind of at the heart of all this? And by the way, Greg, I realized I've picked up James Comey's up voice. Right? Remember Carter Page? Except that is a question, so it's okay to do. But Carter Page was the guy who, and I remember at some point he did an interview, I believe, it was on MSNBC. I want to say it was Chris Hayes. I could be wrong. It was some version where he basically was just blurting everything out, and Hayes is like, "Are you sure you don't want to have a lawyer present? You probably you're speaking like a man who's not afraid of being indicted, and the investigation is complete, and Carter Page has not been indicted. Maybe Carter Page has a very bad judgment in who he hangs out with, and his views on Russia are naively optimistic about Putin's. Being a fool is not against the law." And, so we will see how this shakes out. But, again, this sudden insistence of spying, this wasn't spying at all. It was merely court-ordered electronic surveillance is certainly going to be, it certainly is raising eyebrows about how adamant people are that the word spying is completely out of line here when you're secretly trying to learn more information about people.
On that note, Jim, hope the car's packed, hit the road, fill the tank. Good luck. Be safe.
Looking forward to that, Greg. Hope you have a good, happy Easter. Everyone else out there, enjoy your week ahead. And you and I will touch back, at least briefly, the following week.
Exactly right. Happy Easter to you, Jim. Have a good weekend to all of our listeners. The 3 Martini Lunch will be in all of next week. I'll be here for the first couple of days. David French will be in for Jim. And until then, have a great weekend and join us Monday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.